The news that many dreaded reached Virginia in May in 1774. The British Parliament, determined to punish the inhabitants of Boston for the destruction of thousands of pounds of tea in December 1773, closed Boston harbor to all commerce until restitution was paid to the East India Company and the King's Treasury. The sum included the value of the tea destroyed and the uncollected duties on the tea. British warships, as well as 4 regiments of British regulars, were ordered to Boston to enforce this punitive measure, the first of what became known as the Intolerable Acts. Reports of further punitive parliamentary acts against Massachusetts reached Virginia in mid-June and increased support among Virginians for the beleaguered colony to the north. Part of Massachusetts' ancient 1691 charter was revoked, and royal appointees replaced elected officials on the Executive Council, the upper chamber of the colonial legislature. Special town meetings, beyond the annually scheduled one for each town, were forbidden without the governor's consent. Perhaps most troubling to Virginians was the passage of the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed the governor to transfer court cases of government officials to Britain, where they would be out of the reach of hostile Massachusetts juries. Many colonists feared that this measure would allow royal officials to act with impunity from the law because the colonists would have no way to hold them accountable for their actions. In addition to these measures, which together with the Boston Port Bill became known as the Intolerable Acts, new reports over the summer of British reinforcements heading to Boston to join the newly appointed military governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, prompted a growing number of Virginians to seriously consider a bold response to Parliament, namely, a boycott of British goods. Not every Virginian supported a boycott, however. Brian Fairfax, a good friend and neighbor of George Washington's, wrote to Colonel Washington in early July and expressed his opposition to such a measure. Fairfax, who agreed that Parliament's actions against Massachusetts were oppressive and unconstitutional, thought that a general colonial boycott would be too provocative to Parliament and difficult to implement. He argued instead that the colonists should send another petition to England appealing for a redress of their grievances. George Washington was skeptical of Fairfax's position. He replied to his friend the next day and asserted that a boycott was overdue. As to your political sentiments, I would heartily join you in them, provided there was the most distant hope of success. But have we not tried this already? Have we not addressed Parliament? And to what end? Did they deign to look at our petitions? Does it not appear, as clear as the sun, that there is a regular, systematic plan formed to fix the right and practice of taxation upon us? Does not the uniform conduct of Parliament for some years past confirm this? Is there anything to be expected from petitioning after this? Is not the attack upon the liberty and property of the people of Boston plain and self-evident proof of what they are aiming at? Does not the subsequent bills for depriving Massachusetts of its charter convince us that the administration is determined to stick at nothing to carry its point? Ought we not, then, to put our virtue and fortitude to the severest test? With you, I think it is folly to attempt more than we can execute. Yet, I think we may do more than is generally believed in respect to the non-importation scheme. Brian Fairfax remained troubled by what he viewed as an escalating policy of confrontation. He wrote another letter to Washington in mid-July and urged restraint. He believed that patient petitions and appeals to Britain had the best chance of changing British policy. Fairfax wanted to wait for the outcome of yet another petition to Parliament before stronger actions were taken. He told Washington that Americans ought to consider the majority of the English Parliament as acting from honest though erroneous principles. Whatever corruption there may be in the Parliament, whatever unjust designs some men may have, we ought to gain the affections of those who mean well. We should strive to conciliate the affections of England. It is incredible how far a mild behavior contributes to a reconciliation in any dispute between man and man. Fairfax repeated his fear that an aggressive approach toward Parliament would only offend and anger that body, and result in the rejection of colonial appeals. Colonel Washington, however, had already abandoned hope that the petition would sway Parliament. He responded to his friend on July 20th. I see nothing to induce a belief that the Parliament would embrace a favorable opportunity of repealing acts, which they go on with great rapidity to pass, in order to enforce their tyrannical system. In fact, I observe that Parliament is pursuing a regular plan at the expense of law and justice to overthrow our constitutional rights and liberties. How can I expect any redress from a measure which has been ineffectually tried already? Washington then reminded Fairfax what was at stake in the dispute. For, sir, what is it we are contending against? Is it against paying the duty of 3 pence per pound on tea because it is burdensome? No, it is the right only we have all along disputed, and to this end we have already petitioned his Majesty in a humble and dutiful manner as subjects could do. Nay, more, we applied to Parliament, setting forth that as Englishmen we could not be deprived of our constitutional rights. Washington maintained that Parliament's harsh treatment of Massachusetts demonstrated its intention to enforce arbitrary rule over all the colonies. He ended with a similar explanation of his position. I think the Parliament of Great Britain hath no more right to put their hand into my pocket without my consent than I have to put my hand into yours for money, and this is already being urged to them in a firm but decent manner by all the colonies. What reason is there to expect anything from their justice? The founders understood something that current people for the most part are too selfish to think about, which is when a government passes a bill which will hurt or is meant to punish a certain group, it is only a matter of time before they do it to you. Washington didn't say, well, that's Massachusetts' problem, not mine. That is currently how many people think. We have to stand together, as the Virginia House of Burgesses stated. We are further clearly of opinion that an attack made on one of our sister colonies to compel submission to arbitrary taxes is an attack made on all British America, and threatens ruin to the rights of all, unless the united wisdom of the whole is applied. Washington was standing on principles, supporting boycotts as a way to get attention without violence. Boycotts are important. Don't spend your money on people who hate you and what you stand for. Depriving people of resources is one aspect of war, and make no mistake, there is a war for competing visions for what America should be.